Okay, we're here with Michael Tsarion at the Beyond Knowledge conference, and Michael is going to give his talk on Irish origins. And Michael, for viewers that might not be familiar with you or your research, maybe you can give us a short little background on what you've been researching and studying over the years.
Well, recently I just published a book called The Irish Origins of Civilization, and it's a 2-volume set, but usually I do a DVD, along with most of the work that I do. I like focus on making DVDs most of the time. So this book is one that actually doesn't have a companion DVD or anything like that, and I didn't even think I was going to do a public talk or anything on it. But it came that David and I invited me to Liverpool, and I said, oh, well, maybe that would be a good platform. I mean, I actually haven't even done a talk in Britain. This is the first talk I've ever done, in the 7-8 years that I've been public with this material. I've been spoke mostly in America, and I had no plans to do a talk in England or Britain or anything like that, but this came up and it just felt right. I also have I get offers all the time, all over the world, to do this and that and the other, and usually I turn it down for various reasons. But this seemed right. It seemed like the right time. It's a good lineup of speakers, of course. Some people doing compatible research that I've done that sort of impacts what I've done. Ralph Ellis, whose work I draw upon a great deal, so it'll be fun from that point of view. Also, just a lot of people now are really interested in what I'm doing. Before in Britain, it was a lot of people are still very hesitant to get into any of this kind of material, and turnouts were small. I mean, and David, these are people who were close to David Icke, whose work I like a lot. So it just seemed that the time was right, and there's a good lineup of speakers, and they agreed that I could do a talk based on some of the highlights. You get an hour or 2 hours or whatever the talk is, so it's impossible to really get into great detail. But I feel so strongly about this particular age that we're living in right now. I mean, the last 10, 15 years, the next 7 years, we're in a perfect time, I believe, for some huge, pseudo-mythologies, to be refuted with newfound evidence, new information, new memes, new concepts that people need to start getting their heads around. And we are finding people from all walks of life who are pretty much convinced now that the history of the world particularly is just so much bogus nonsense, you know what I mean? And this is partly also because of new archaeological discoveries. And this very much impacts the work I've been researching all my life. And I'm sure that we'll get into the whole essence of my work, which is the movement of the elements of civilization from the west to the east. This is a huge piece, which, upsets the tables of established historical idea. It's not to say that there wasn't any significant migrations from the east. There were. There definitely were, both out of the Middle East, out of Egypt. There's no question about that. But these movements were very late in the day. Plus, I also identify, my work, targets the groups that are behind Masonry, not just behind the Vatican or Catholicism or the world religions, but the very sinister forces who operate from behind the secret societies like the Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus, you name it, the Freemasons, these kinds of groups that people now are getting into. They're aware that these oligarchs, control affairs. There's a whole control matrix in the world. So my work is to try and establish their exact identity. And my mentors always insist that in this great power pyramid, there's a top layer. And even by their own symbolism, these secret societies are pretty ambiguous. They don't obviously want us to know who these people are. They really don't even want us to know who the lower henchmen are. But my big, research, my sort of big question is, who are the true architects of control at the top of the pyramid? Can we get a profile on them, a forensic profile? And when you start looking into this, this opens up incredible areas. I mean, it's one of the most interesting areas of research. So the book was finally to share this. It wasn't planned. There has been years, not just in my lifetime, but in previous centuries, when great teachers that I mentioned throughout my work, had their books suppressed, had their work suppressed. Because as I say, once you start getting into this, then you're up against, all the lies that we've been told, and I identify the creatures who are behind these organizations, both religious, theological, and political, as Atonists. That's just a term. Term has to be defined. The Atonists are a very interesting coterie that came out of Egypt, whose leader originally was the famous Pharaoh Akhenaten. And a lot of stuff has been written on Akhenaten, but also a lot of spurious stuff is starting to be written. I do somersaults in gratitude that we're into secret societies now, and knowledge is like I say, their own light is being shined upon them. You see, this is crucial, and I'm so happy for it. But in the rush to do this, you get a lot of erroneous information. It's not consciously disseminated or anything like that, but you get up cul-de-sacs with this information because it's a huge study, and it encompasses all the countries of the world and so many other areas. So it's very important to know your facts. So when people are saying, oh, the eye at the top of the pyramid itself, we accept that this is Egyptian, but then is it the eye of Horus? Is it the eye of Amun-Ra? You see, we've got questions about that. Well, to me, it's the eye of Aton, and you can prove it because if you look into our society, as I've done, and you find that the Christian religion, the politics, the designs of cities, the corporate logos, all of the symbolism is solar. It's a specific kind of symbolism. It's solar symbolism. And the great patriarchs, the great oligarchs, the great hierarchs of the solar cults, this is what I study, because there were these power cults of old, and the Atonists grew out of these ancient cults. They're a sort of a warped version of the solar cult. So even when you indict solarism or solar cultism, you have to be very specific, because there's nothing wrong with solar cultism. There's nothing wrong with any of these cults. But these cults spawn various warped branches, corrupt branches. And Atonism, metaphysically speaking, is the worship of the dark side of light, the dark side of the sun, which Christians might want to call Luciferianism, and they're not far wrong there. It's actually an accurate statement when you know what these terms really mean. And this is why when you read Albert Pike and the various Freemasons who talk about worshipping Lucifer, when you see this term dropped in Theosophy, when you see this term dropped anywhere, once you understand that there's nothing necessarily evil about it, it's a catchphrase, it's a talismanic word, it's a signature of a particular cult that's operated in the world now for thousands of years, that originated about 1400 BC. So I've tracked these individuals and found so many interesting things about them. And this is what my work goes into, and it's absolutely correct to say that these Atonists who were spawned in Egypt, finally after their expulsion, this expulsion is written about in the Bible as the Exodus, and there were 2 Exoduses, not one. Some scholars refer to this as the Great Hyksos Exodus, and they're absolutely correct there, because the famous and ambiguous Hyksos, pharaohs of Egypt, are none other than these Atonists. So they are the ones who definitely, they had a traversal from the eastern lands to the west. So when you are reading history that always posits that the elements of civilization, and what do I mean by that? I mean everything from writing, from alphabet to musical tropes, to architectural tropes, to mathematical tropes, everything from pyramid building to basket weaving, to all sorts of interesting symbolism, again, important aspects of symbolism. We only have to look in the cities of the world to notice all the Egyptian symbolism. Well, traditionally, on paper, most people will go, oh, but that's so easy to explain. That's just the movement of Eastern groups, Middle Eastern groups, Oriental groups, Egyptian groups, moving west and bringing these tropes with them. That's why you find Egyptian symbolism on the heraldry of the West, and so forth and so on. There's elements of truth to this, because this incredible group that I'll be speaking about, the Atonists, the Luciferians, the ones who are behind the world matrix of control, were in fact expurged or expunged or thrown out or exiled from the land of Egypt. And the story of why is fascinating. The scholar Ralph Ellis, like I've mentioned, has delved into this, but also has recently Ahmed Osman, another excellent author called Mustafa Gedala. They've all delved into this identification and what happened to Akhenaten, what happened to Tutankhamun, what happened to Pharaoh Aya, you see. What was this internecine struggle? Why did it get created? Who was doing what to whom? And then, is it in fact true, after all these years, after all these lies, after all this clerical mumbo-jumbo and malarkey, is it in fact true that the so-called Israelites of the Bible were these Atonists stroke Hyksos, you see, and their expulsion, which is they fade into history, they fade away? Can we pick up the trail again and find out that these characters moved west, bringing many tropes with them? All accurate. So I'm not refuting that there was no east to west movement. We know there were. but these are in relatively late periods of history. And we forget this because we're living in the 20th century where we think, you know, something 20 years ago was old, right? But 1400 BC is not old. Birth of Christ is not a long time ago. This is extremely recent, you know, historical happenings and occurrences. What we should be asking questions like I do about who were the Hyksos? What was their origins? Who are these Atonists? Where did they come from? You know, who is this Akhenaten? Where did he get these ideas? Who civilized Egypt in the first place? I mean, the greatest historians have asked this question. The only thing is, when you come up with the answers, not a lot of the world structure wants to hear it. The establishment is very threatened by, you know, the answers to all of these questions, because the questions are remarkable, fascinating, fascinatingly interesting. And of course, I never really stray away too much from the study of words, the study of symbols, because I believe strongly that this is where a lot of secrets lie. Granted, it's not a tremendously rigorous study in an academic sense, but so what? You know, we sacrifice that because the scope and the impact of what we discover counterbalances that. Because you may lack a certain amount of rigor and so forth that an academic is used to, but so much for their academic, so much for their rigor. They're not the ones answering these big questions. They're not answering, you know, how we're hurtling towards a new world order. They're not answering so many of the most important questions in the world. They're not contributing. And any of the ones that did contribute were mavericks who were literally suppressed, right? And the list is long. Commons Beaumont, people I mentioned in my work, Conor McAdary, Anna Wilkes, Immanuel Velikovsky. There's a long line of suppressed scholars that long before the time of Ralph Ellis and Ahmed Osman, you see, we're already looking into this, and had answered all of these questions about the identity of the Israelites, and that the fact, of course, we hear about the Israelites being divided into basically two camps, the 10 tribes of so-called Israel, and the 2 tribes of Judah. So I just stop there, my work stops there and goes, let's identify these terms. Where'd it come from? Israelite. Wow, that's very close to the Irish term for one of their chief solar gods, right? Ra is an Egyptian word. El is our Al, right? What's going on here? You know, Jordan Maxwell and others have said, well, what's going on here is that these cults who now operate in the world, you know, have come together. Or let's say more correctly that corrupted people, the coterie has cannibalized these ancient churches, because that's what they were. They were cults, they were churches, they were theologies. And what we have today in modern religion is a hodgepodge of all of this cultism, particularly solar cultism. You know, so the talk is going to go into that. It's going to go into acknowledging that if you're reading history that has been compiled by Atonists who did in fact leave Egypt and move from the east to the west, and you're now reading the histories composed by their descendants, well, that's what you're going to believe, isn't it? But it doesn't make it true. It doesn't tell you that thousands upon thousands of years before that movement and others that are in the AD era, there was migrations, much more primordial migrations from the western lands, and I mean specifically Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland, etc., you know, and Scandinavia, which I believe were joined by land bridges. There was migrations of a quite large population. Sometimes the entire inhabitants had to vacate, and that these migrations from the western lands into the eastern lands are the true reasons for the spread of what we would call the elements of civilization: the music, the dance, the pentatonic scale, you know, the architectural imagery, the symbolism, the alphabetical tropes. And so when we're dabbling and reading, a person gets into this for the first time and they start hearing terms like Phoenician. I mean, don't ask where the word comes from, you see, or Kabiri, or Chaldean. You know, we got some tidying up to do. And if we're looking to academica to tell us the facts about this, or the facts about the language, or the facts about what's called dispersion, you may have a long wait. Do not hold your breath waiting for these guys to come up with the answers. It's a 70-30 split. They may seed their work, their theories, their conjectures with elements of truth, but they also put in a great deal that leads you totally astray. And so my work is controversial, it is alternative. But as I said, more and more people are getting into this stuff. They're finding out that there's something going on in the world. They're looking at the symbolism of these cults that are slowly being exposed, and they want to know where it all came from. And as I said, a lot of scholars who are hasty, who don't know too much of the background, they tend to get a lot of stuff wrong. And you know, so it's important to correct a lot of errors in this particular study.
Indeed, and you know, one cornerstone, so to speak, of this movement, as it were, either if we talk about the British Israelite movement or Atonism connecting with Christianity. Jesus, as you said, or even / Lucifer, as you explained, is a big part of this movement, of course. Is there any way we can kind of separate, the mythological character Jesus, and if there potentially even was a real character of Jesus? How does your work go into that?
Yeah, absolutely, strongly. In fact, almost a good portion of Volume 2 of the Irish Origins books looks into this quite deeply and brings to bear a lot of scholars that people may not have heard of. But it also brings to bear very modern research. There's a thing called the Jesus Seminar. They meet every 5-10 years, whatever it is. These are the greatest theologians, the greatest scholars, the greatest biblicists you can imagine from all these prestigious think tanks and universities sitting around tables, analyze, should any new parchments or new documents come, they take care of that, they study that. They've completely scanned the Essene, the so-called Essenes. There's that word Essa again. But let's bypass that for now. They study any Gnostic Gospels, anything that comes to light, new papyri, all of this is these study. These are Aramaic scholars, whatnot. So before you get into all the radical stuff I'm into, just these characters, and they publish their books after the Jesus Seminar is over, and they've collated their notes, and they've mulled over the Testaments and the Bible and all the miscellaneous stuff, the Masoretic texts, all the pseudo-epigraphica, the Apocrypha. See, the average Christian, they're like dumbfounded when you talk about this because they don't know any, this exists. To them it's just the Bible and what it says. They don't know there's over 200 interpretations of almost every passage in the Bible, or that historians that are mentioned in the Bible, or biblical historians or clergymen or any of these church fathers, compile biblical texts referring to historians that now are proven not to have existed. So an historian who his own identity is spurious is commenting upon another historian that nobody can prove existed, and this qualifies as biblical study, biblical research. Or the Jesus Seminar coming away, publishing their work, saying, well, guess what, guys? Over 80% of the words in the New Testament that are ascribed to Jesus, well, they're inauthentic. They cannot be corroborated. I think they're 20% and lower. If that doesn't atomize, but see, the thing is, it doesn't. The Vatican's still going strong. I don't see any one cardinal less or any churches coming down or locking their doors going, well, the fraud's over, we're packing up and you're doing something else. We'll invest in some football teams or something like that, No, the edifice still continues going, and yet here are just the latest guys. We're not talking about the John Allegros and the people who've been suppressed, who found out things that would just dumbfound the world if this facts was brought to light. Oh boy, I know we do hours on that, and this is what my work goes into, all of this thing, all these miscellaneous, or the Dionysian cult, or any of these incredible things. But these are just straightforward scholars who now can show you that there's not a shred. Let's not even get into then the Thomas L. Thompsons and the archaeologists who've got a voice, who'd love to come and be interviewed, and I'd love to tell you that, well, guys, guess what? We go out doing digs in Judea, Palestine, Galilee, etc., and all that stuff that's written in the Bible, the Nazareths, the Galilees, the temples of X, Y, and Z, we can't find any of this stuff. And then the few Christians go, oh, we found it, we've done digs in there's, but then you put in their face, yes, but every new find that you do make, and believe me, these are paltry discoveries, whenever they do make one, it actually flies in the face of, again, the traditional story that's been handed down to us for thousands of years. Namely, that if they dig up a certain shrine, it's covered in astrological motifs. My next book is going to be on astrotheology. It's a lifelong study. I've done a DVD on it. Yeah, every new discovery starts showing, symbols of the zodiac in so-called Judaic, even if you accept that term. There's been a play on words that you wouldn't believe, the misconstruing of words and terms and names. But even if you believe that these are Judaic, you still get the answer, how come there's zodiacs all over the place? So the astrotheological tie-in is massive. This brings me to the heart of your question. Did Jesus as a man exist? Well, in the official histories of the time, like say, for instance, the very ambiguous and highly controversial Josephus Flavian Piso, you got 19 guys called Jesus. It's a very common name. And even he has a hell of a time establishing who's the man that's meant to be in the Bible. We know that's written by St. Paul. It's St. Paul who's the great proselytizer of Jesus. It's St. Paul, the wonderful Saul, who was converted on the road to Damascus, right? He's the biographer. But then guess what? Ralph Ellis and people before him have established that this very St. Paul is none other than the same Flavian Josephus Piso. funded by the Vespasians and the Roman emperors, who I've identified as, in league with, or even perhaps bloodline descended from the same Atonists. See the story when I say what this opens up? So here we go. So when Ralph Ellis is saying, well, I've identified him out of those 19 geezers, I know who it was. It was Jesus of Gamala. And he was a political figure. Well, then I'm very interested in that. Because that's what, my mentors have also established, that we're talking about historical personages in here, but they bear very little resemblance to the man that St. Paul is talking about that most Christians, are kneeling and praying to. To be specific, what does that mean? When a man like Tony Bushby or Ralph Ellis and many others who've identified a historical personage that appears to be like Jesus, again, let me be specific. Tony Bushby has identified two people who very closely approximate the man in the Bible. One, and his source is the Talmud, partly, is a guy called Yeshua ben Panthera, or Panthera, right? And he was a twin of a guy called Judas Crestus. Judas Crestus, with a K. Crestus with a K. And these two characters were rescripted into one character that fit the Jesus of the Bible. In other readings, they think that the Judas Crestus was the Judas Iscariot, again, in relation to the Jesus, the soft-hearted, more compassionate guy, was the Ben Panthera character. What does Tony Bushby do? He tracks those two characters to England, to Britain. In his mind, they're historical. The Talmud gives you information about them, that there was an Egyptian connection. But most importantly, is that they were political figures only. In other words, they were what a Jewish person would understand as a messianic character. This is so important because Christians get befuddled with all of this as soon as you mention the word Jesus. So even if in the talk or in my work, you can only grasp this one simple fact, realize that we're talking not just about a historical versus a spiritual character, we're also talking about a Jewish versus a Christian reading of that. Because if it's in fact later proven, as it is now being proven, as it has been established in the past, that a Jesus man is different than a Christ Savior, you may have one in the place of the other. You may be reading one where the other should be. This, once you understand this, also it helps the reading of the Bible, by the way. It accounts for the strange schizophrenia in the character of Jesus. Because the Judas Crestus who's going around kicking over tables and telling you I brought a sword and we're going to handle things that way is a very different creature than the Christ who's forgive your brother, forget this eye for an eye. See, so it's not schizophrenia of one man, it's two men. So the Bushby thesis is very strong. It's additionally strong because he tracks those two characters, or one of them anyway, and I think Mary Magdalene also, by way of Rome, from Judea, through the Herod family, up into Rome, married to the Caesars, welcomed by the Caesars, decide to move on and end up in Wales, end up in Britain. Isn't that familiar as what we know now as the Holy Blood, the Grail sagas, which so many people are writing on, you see? Okay, then we move to Ralph Ellis again. He says he's done it. He, from all these 19 geezers, has worked out it's a Jesus of Gamala. We find exactly the same things in his work as I've said about Bushby. What is this Jesus of Gamala? He is no savior. He is no divine incarnate Son of God. He is a political figure that is in fact descended from Parthians, Persians. He's a descendant of Cleopatra by way of Caesar, Julius Caesar. He is he's vying for in fact he even has a call on the Roman Empire. Political figure. Whatever way you cut it. No, none of this divine intervention, Holy Ghosts and all that. Okay, so here we got another political figure, and Ralph Ellis tracks this character through Rome, you see, out of Judea, out of those lands. In fact, he tracks him from Persia originally, all over the place, into Egypt, through Judea, back to Rome, and then eventually the guy ends up as a prisoner, some sort of like Count of Monte Cristo stroke man in the Iron Mask. He languishes in a prison over there, in England, and now there's a car park over his grave. Fascinating. The thing is, with all of this, that anyone who studied what is known as British Israelitism, which you mentioned in your question, starts to, they're interested in this because we've heard of this, not just in the lifetime of the scholars I've mentioned, but for hundreds of years, right? Since Lord Palmerston and going back to the whole, and by the way, British Israelites are basically the same coterie that we would know as the Zionists today. There's not a shred of difference. But what people, when you think of a Zionist, you think of political stuff, you think of Israel, you think of fighting, you think of a lot of, political activity and action. What they don't know is that behind Zionism is an ideology, a very fascinating ideology that's sort of a hybrid of Judaism, a hybrid of Christianism, a hybrid of Masonry. And it's called British Israelite philosophy. It's tremendously important for people to read up on this. And I cover it extensively in my work. And these British Israelites have always been maintaining, and in their works they always maintain that the man Jesus, either as a small child or as a grown-up, accompanied his, first of all, most importantly, they say he survived the crucifixion. So now you can understand why even to even bring up this kind of conversation amongst Christians, you're already going to have, be pilloried, because survive the crucifixion? What's that? Who are you? What are you? So you're going to have resistance there from people who believe, but that's not true. That Jesus Christ was crucified and he was resurrected and all that. Son of God. What about these scholars who come along going, no, he was a political figure who ended up in his whole coterie ended up in Britain. They're tied in with the elites of Britain. They're tied in with the Roman elites. St. Paul even mentions Roman centurions, right, in his work. Remember, Paul was an apologist for the Romans. He worked out of Rome. So all these elements come to bear. So then when you find this out, you realize that this character historically, and there could be 20 others for Bushby's work and elsewhere, you could have 20 other guys. In fact, Mustafa Kemal's take on all of this is that it's Tutankhamun. That the Jesus character goes back to Tutankhamun. So you got so many different theories. Yeah. But the most important thing is that this person is a physical character. He bears no resemblance to the divine creature that is mentioned, you see, by St. Paul. Then when you find out that, wait a minute, did these Romans hire St. Paul, whose real name is Josephus Piso? He's a Flavian. So did the Flavian dynasty, people needed to look up the name Flavian dynasty. People need to look up the word Piso and then find that this character is tracked even to the modern day with the George Bushes of the world. There's a direct relation. The evidence is there. They got to find out, were these propagandists? Were these people who were concocting a incredible story to form and fashion a new religion that would serve, the West, would be propaganda, that wanted to take elements from Judaism, but make sure also that they didn't go too far with that, and concoct a religion. Now the thing that you have to understand, though, is that the character in the Bible could not in any strength of the imagination be a physical personage like we've been talking about. It just doesn't work. No matter how you try to glue these Jesus of Gamalas or Judas Chrestuses to the man in the Bible, it doesn't work, and that is because St. Paul embellished his character with many familiar tropes that belong to thousands of years before, to cultures before, meaning paganism. Jews understand this. This is why Jews do not accept the divine aspect. So when that's what the reason for people who've ever wondered why it is that Jews don't accept Jesus, because they don't accept the Christ as portrayed by St. Paul with all of solar, astrological, pagan elements, because the Jews have done their homework. And they know that those elements come from Mithraism, right? In fact, people have tracked the similarities between the Jesus of the Bible and Mithras are pages long. Volumes long are the comparisons between just the ancient god Mithras. But let's bring in Osiris. Let's bring in Serapis. Let's bring in Zoroaster. Let's bring in the Celtic and pre-Celtic Iessa. We got 101 gods that share, so St. Paul, in order to appease the Romans, or maybe funded by the Romans, maybe drew on some historical characters, but far more of a concern was to create a mythological character, which had been done for thousands of years. So it is now coming out through the concepts that that astrotheologists understand, is that mostly what you're reading in the Bible surrounding, and it's irrefutable, by the way, once you know, even though it is refuted. But the fact of the matter is that the solar tropes that surround Jesus, come out of the solar cult. As soon as I see this kind of information myself, as soon as I see this kind of symbolism surrounding a figure like Jesus, I know we're talking solar cultism here. Ancient churches that go back not only through Atonism, but through Ammonism, you see, into the depths of the history of the world, into Irish Druidism. And anyone who reads the Bible with educated eyes will notice that so many passages in the Bible, we're up into the dozens and even into the hundreds of passages of the Bible, are very much filled with Druidic imagery. from Ireland. So this is, I believe there is a possibility, that there were these historical political figures that would be very much be speaking to the Jewish world. Jewish scholars have no problem, Jewish people have no problem accepting a messianic character. They got 100 of them. Judas Maccabeus, Simon Magus. The list is endless, you see. In fact, even during the so-called Jesus' time of AD 20, AD 33, there's about 3 guys running around. Even at the time that they say, allegedly, they were saying, we're it. We're of the messianic bloodline, you see. So it's a non-stop story. The final thing to say about all of this bloodline, Holy Grail, British Israelite concept is this, that now that some physical historical characters, 1, 2, or 3 of them, have been tracked to Britain, I'm happy because what that does is it puts the final postscript to this whole British Israelite Holy Grail bloodline jive. Because to me, most of that is a complete and utter distraction. I call them red herrings in my work. We're talking about, I'm not saying that these are not the most fascinating books to read, and I hope people do read them. I hope people are up to par, up to speed on all of these theories. They're fascinating. They make great fiction, like the Da Vinci Code, marvelous. But, who's concocting all of this? Who's creating all of this? And who is portraying, who's painting their own picture here? Why do I say something so radical? Why am I not part of that whole establishment? Why am I not pumping British Israelitism or Holy Blood, Holy Grail? Why am I not myself? It's fascinating. It's because to me it's a sideline. That is created as a distraction for the true story of the Atonists, for the true story of the takeover of the West, for the true story of the true Luciferians, the true solar cultisms, who don't have one Jesus Christ type figure but dozens. That these are individuals who have written histories of the world and are hell-bent on making sure that the big story of history, namely the West-East movement, that's one big one, and others like that, are not found out. They have a double duty to make sure their own history is highly skewed so that you don't see certain facts, although many facts are now coming to light. But these facts impact solar cults of the modern age. When you're studying Islam, you're studying a solar cult. When you're studying Christianity, you're studying solar cult. You're also studying other cults, like the stellar cult. You got to look at the flag of Islamic movement. You see a crescent moon and stars. That's all the remnants and relics and vestiges you see of earlier cults. Same with the Romans when you study the Romans. Who are the Romans? Are these people put before you in certain movies? Well, that's like you might as well then believe that the pirates were these swashbuckling Errol Flynn types. I mean, and that's what people unfortunately believe when they see all of this, because these propagandists and what I call mythmongers have done a marvelous job. They've put millions of dollars into this stuff. So the question of the historical Jesus and the spiritual Christ, you see, is something that Christianity has to start looking into now, because it has the greatest impact. And if people want to, fascinate themselves with the historical personage and find out what he did and what he ate for, breakfast and, all these kinds of interesting things, and where he ended up and was he a prisoner, and how many stories and mythologies may have spurned from that. There are many. You see, remember I was saying that it's been very important for British Israelites to establish in their work that a Christ or a Jesus did walk what's called the green and pleasant land of England. And this has been picked up in many poems and many traditions and many occult traditions of England. There's many people into this. They believe this. They love this. That he arrived at Glastonbury. He may have been accompanied by a guy called Joseph of Arimathea. They shook hands with the Druids, give each other big hugs. They love, on sight. And the Druids just immediately fell at the feet of Jesus and all this stuff. Again, very important propaganda to make you not realize that all the Druids of England and Ireland were annihilated by these very people we're talking about. So there was anything but a nice smooth transition, where they all sat around and, cracked a lot of Budweisers together and had a party, said, gee, you guys are our long lost, brethren and all of this kind of thing. This is how it's put before you see. It's the same way that the Knights Templars, the Knights of Columbus, the holy ones, always being put before you now in the media. Da Vinci Code, what we've got, National Treasure, we've got Indiana Jones, and a marvelous portrayal of the hard done by, secret societies and occult orders, how they are so great, the keepers of the secret wisdom, the holders of wisdom for all mankind, pilloried, burned at the stake, and then you find out that none of this is true. The discoverers of America. You see that this thing can go on and on and on. And all the time, even though there's elements of truth in that, the true story, is just even more fascinating. Now to end on the idea, we said a lot about the physical Jesus. What about the story of the pagan Jesus, the Sun King? that is the going to be dealt with. It's dealt with extensively in the Irish Origins book, but it will be dealt with in a slightly different way in the new book on astrotheology, because this opens up, to me, the most fascinating of all areas. The stuff that really puts like Sentex explosives underneath the foundations of the leviathans of evil that are ruling the world. The story of the stars. That all the religions of the world, especially Judeo-Christianity, their main tropes, they're just branches of the tree of Druidism, and they're just branches of Ammonism, and they're just branches of astrotheology. And the story of the goddess, you see the story of the gods, the incredible story of how even gods come into being, and why men would want to build temples, why most of the temples of the world are oriented towards constellations, why so many stars and constellations and luminaries and symbols, like we said, the sun earlier, are incorporated into corporate design, civic centers, murals, leitmotifs. Cities like Bath, cities like Cambridge, cities like London, cities like Cologne, cities like, of course, Washington, D.C., that has been exposed. Or even, let's think, Paris.
Paris.
You see, all of these cities that have obelisks galore. So when you look at an obelisk, which is Egyptian, and you see a cross at the top of it, is somebody trying to tell you that Christianity and Egyptology are connected? I didn't build it, but somebody did. Or go to Vatican City and see pine cones and skulls and bones, you see. We've got a story here. And we've also got the PR, the spin, on the front of that story, so you never find out. And so when people then are thinking, well, I guess what? The Pope, he's wearing a Jewish yarmulke. Or he's got this, wearing the Cohen breastplate. And they think only that those come from the traditions of Judaism. And they stop right there. Like I said, they do the same thing with the pyramid, you see, or the obelisk and all of these symbols, or the lion. Wow, what a symbol. You find it even number 10 Downing Street, right? And they think, oh, that's Judaic. But they never ask, who were the Jews? Are the people you think they were, who they were? Where did that word come from? Where does that term come from? Are the Jews that are living today really connected to the Yahuds, those two tribes, you see? The Israelites? What happens if that's not true? What happens if Abraham and Isaac and Joseph and Jacob, leading all the way up to the modern Jesus, turn out to be pharaohs of Egypt, connected to pharaonic dynasties? If that doesn't upset. But as fascinating as all of this is, this always must dovetail with the story of the heavens, the story of the zodiac, the story of the stars. Because theology does not arise without astrology. It's the underpinnings of it all. And you can't have political edifices without theology. So one leads to the other. So it's time now, and it's not that it hasn't been said before. I mean, my work draws very heavily on the great astrotheologists of the 1800s, particularly Gerald Massey. But there's other great names, you see, the American Alvin Boyd Kuhn. My books are dedicated to these people. I've grown up reading their works. At one point, these books were very, very hard to find. They still are hard to find if you're looking for, editions, not reprints, but physical editions. So this is the work that really shows you the true origins of all theology, all Judeo-Christianity, where it came from. That is what man needs to know now. Man needs to know now the origins of these religions. He can believe in them or he can not believe in them, but the time has come for him to uncover the origins of it. Just like a botanist does, a genealogist does. You see, anyone who's working in any field always knows where a thing began. And to me, the story of the birth of religion, which connects to the zodiac, and it's not the story of astrology, it's quite different. We're not talking strictly only about what, and in fact, one of my biggest peeves, why I've even decided to publish on this, is because I'm so sick and tired. Not only are the books of Gerald Massey and other scholars suppressed, but don't we have entire astrological book sections in most of the bookstores of the world, or in the libraries of the world? Do you know how infrequently the word astrotheology appears in those books? And yet these are the guys meant to be telling you all about it. And except for a passing reference, you see, to the true story of the stars of the heavens, you get nothing. So to me, that's defunct. I'm against things like that. I'm against, they have whole coteries churning out books, running off the mill, off the press, who don't tell you the story. It's either they haven't done their homework or, they're not honoring the mentors of the past. The time has come to tell the specific story about the rise of Judeo-Christianity out of Atonism, out of Ammonism, and out of the mystery of the stars, that was for thousands and thousands of years. The whole story of Jesus, and all the story of so many other figures. And as I say, none of this would matter if it wasn't for the fact that the people controlling the world today are either ideologically or biologically descended from these same creatures I'm talking about. This is the thing to always bear in mind. Otherwise, people start thinking this is just dry history. And they lose the purpose, the raison d'etre. Now, topically, interestingly, this is the first book in over 100 years to have the term astrotheology on the cover. I look at that as being that it's something saying the time has come. Because I never believe that I am unguided in all of this. Because you have to be guided to be into this work. That's, all I'll say about it. So it's something else sort of guiding a person like me to these studies. Remember, because you can have an interest, but finding the facts, that's guidance from a muse or some other agency. And so I believe that we're in what we call the Age of Awakening, in which if people who are attentive, people who are critical, people who are doubtful, people who are sick to death of the lie mechanism, if they remain attentive and curious and open-minded, they're going to be empowered by some knowledge that maybe hasn't visited this planet for centuries, for millennia. Stuff that's been covered up and buried. The pieces are still there. It's just a matter of looking for them, hunting them, and putting them in the right order. And an amazing story unfolds. So the concepts of, this all connects, because whether you were a Druid, whether you were an Atonist, whether you were a Luciferian, whether you were a Chaldean, whether you were a Native American Indian, whether you were a Brahmin, one thing that all these groups have is subservience to the cults that we've been talking about. They were worshippers of the heavens, their gods, their pantheons, and this includes the Romans, and it includes the Greeks, and it includes the modern era. The oligarchs who are running the show today, by the way, are Caesars of a kind. They're descended from the same families, by the way. And you better believe that they are fully and utterly educated in these subjects, and that they do rituals on certain times of the stellar calendar, openings of this, closings of that, euro dollars, any form of initiations or public addresses, or the whole 9 yards. I go into this in various works. So many, examples of this, not only impacting 9/11 and the dates of that, but dates of so many other things. These people do it based on astrology, the laying of cornerstones, the foundations of cities, the alignments of buildings, the alignments of temples, all sorts of things that they're doing in plain view, but nobody notices it. The time has come to start noticing it. As I said, to shine the light that they claim to love right on their own faces.
I want to touch upon one point there that you mentioned that's very interesting, and that is the connection, if you will, between Christianity and Luciferianism or Lucifer and Christ. Many Christian people who have a Protestant Christian background today look at world leaders, what have you, and look at this as a satanic cult. But there is a connection that I feel that Luciferianism and Christianity, there is a connection between these two, and that there potentially could be kind of an occult branch of Christianity, an esoteric branch of Christianity, that, as you mentioned before, like Albert Pike, they are venerating Lucifer in that sense. Would you say it's a misnomer to call these people Satanists in that regard, but they're truly Luciferians and the world leaders today and people of this cult? There is a clear actual connection between Christianity and Luciferianism in that sense?
Well, see, as soon as you mention the word Satanism, you're talking a version of Christianity, because the Satan that most people think they know about is a concoction, even though it's an antithetical, thing. But it comes under the heading, you have to be Christian to accept that there's a Satan. In fact, the word Satan simply, I think in Aramaic or Hebrew, it just simply meant opposer. It didn't mean anything evil at all. The people that I'm talking about are evil, but you see, what people who think in terms of devils and hells and darkness and satanic stuff have to get around the idea that these people are worshippers of light, a very specific kind of light. So I always use the term Luciferian or Atonism in order to get away from those loaded terms like Satanism and stuff like that, because you see, it's very important. Otherwise, like I said, remember we were saying about the cul-de-sacs people can get down? I mean, what's been put before you is already a huge mishmash. So it's not surprising to me that people who study this get all confused. Confused about the Jews, confused about the Christians, confused about Jesus. Was he a man? Was he a God? were the Caesars good or were they bad? All of these were the Druids sacrifices of children, or were they not? We've got questions. There's a lot of stuff happening here. Who were the Essenes and all of this kind of thing? Why did the Vatican suppress the Dead Sea Scrolls for so many years if they had nothing to hide, etc.? And so again, we're in the age now where we can start looking at this objectively. If you were to come from the Judaic world, if you were to come from the Christian world, of course you're going to get confused. Because how are you going to reconcile that the Albert Pikes of the world lionize Jesus? They're always talking about Christianity and the God, and at the same time drop the terms Lucifer. Of course that's going to be confusing only if you're coming from the kinds of coteries, the background, that these same Masonic people have created. They're using terms that are much broader than the little tiny coracle, this little, playpen, this little Wendy house, world that they've kept everybody in. These guys are the architects of control that circle around you, and they know the terms that you don't know. So you're confused when you hear it. Well, my God, you'd be confused about a lot of things if you read the Bible and really read what was in it. So they're using terms that they know the meaning of it. They also know that Lucifer has a tie-in with the planet Venus. Remember we were talking about the astrotheology? They know about the planet Mars. They know about Saturn worship. You see, they're into all of this stuff.
The old Roman gods again, popping up.
Well, these are personifications of the heavenly bodies. Everything is done. Even the word crowning a king is based on the word corona, crom, time, and Saturn. Saturn worship, yeah. The lists go on and on and on. Jordan Maxwell, has gone into this. We continue this research to awaken people to the fact, just look at the symbolism, look at the words. That is really interesting. Studying the Queen's coronation, or this stuff that surrounds the inauguration of presidents, and how these so-called independent presidents who are meant to be sworn opponents of the British system are walking on red carpets. That worries me, because I recognize what that's all about. And when I find out that these characters are in league with, biologically and ideologically, directly connected to the dynasties of Europe that I am exposing, that the use of the double-headed eagle, or the compass in protractor, the use of what? The skull and bones. You see, I know where all these symbols come from. I know that the eye on the top of the pyramid is not the eye of Horus, or the eye of just Ra. You don't have to be specific here. And NATO and the United Nations. So I'll be doing a slideshow, at this conference, which is going to show this in pictorial form to illustrate these points. So it's very important to bring out that they refer to themselves as Luciferians, by the way. That's not, see, isn't it interesting to a Christian that they call themselves that? The problem is that if you're coming from a Christian mindset, you immediately associate that with evil and Satanism, because you're already prejudiced. Your vision is skewed. You're not an occultist. You are a Christian. That's an exoteric branch, just like you implied, of an esoteric order. We have to understand that Islam, Judaism, Christianity, what you know of them anyway, are outer lodges. Masons know this. Masons know there's inner lodges and outer lodges, even to their own societies. Fraternities understand this. They're what's called exoteric branches of esoteric cabals. So they're seniors, the bishops, the cardinals, the prelates, right? They know all this. They know all this. In fact, in the slideshow we'll be going into something about the word, vicar. The history of the etymology of the word vicar. That has very interesting connotations in it, connecting back to the Druids. So again, the symbolism in Vatican City, the words they use, cardinal, the word pope, all of this is just fascinating to look into. And you start to discover that these are worshippers of a kind of light. And again, the origins of that goes back into, again, astrotheology. You can't be talking about light. But light has come down into our world to mean enlightenment, knowledge, wisdom. Because, you see, these characters are very interesting. In all Egyptian pantheon theology, you had two opposing sides. You had the gods of light and the gods of darkness. What that means psychologically is simply knowledge and ignorance. Don't you see that they have a double-headed eagle? Right? Don't we see that they use a lot of these, dualistic images?
Checkerboard, right?
The checkerboard is a very key point, but they have the two pillars. Have you ever noticed that in the lodges, or the pillars at the front of a temple or whatever? But yeah, even going back to the checkerboard, black and white. That's not good and evil, as a Christian might understand it. That's knowledge and ignorance. That's right. Horus and Set. So, as I said, and then people go, but wait a minute, these guys also mention Horus, or they also mention, of course, because as I said, they are a outgrowth warped as it is, of all the cults, not just the solar cult. They don't mind employing the word Amen, you see, and Horus and some other terminology, because remember, they're drawing on the wealth of lots of ancient cults.
And the ancient cults had connection to nature, so consequently a new religion, if we were to say like that, Christianity, a new religion, they're going to have the same elements, if you will, of this, the veneration of nature, or the study of nature, and what is happening in nature, light and day.
That's right.
Things like that, right?
No question about it. It goes all the way up to the movement of the planets, night and day, the diurnal moving, the chessboard. The idea that, and see, the Atonists come to mind here, because the Atonists were fascinated. Akhenaten particularly had a pathological relationship to the darkness. He was a real character that somebody like Sigmund Freud should have analyzed, because he really had something wrong with his brain. These Atonists, as soon as darkness fell, they were considering the world had fallen into the hands of evil, and they would run and go to bed. They rose when the sun rose. You see, they were what's called photophobic, or whatever, photophilia. Absolute lovers of the light. They even called the moon Little Aton. Thinking that it's connected to Aton. All of this kind of thing. So the psychological underpinnings of this are huge, because you see, in the Amonist tradition that preceded the Atonist period and then came back afterwards, they were very balanced. For every god, he had a counterpart, a feminine counterpart. This was hugely important. And so the Amonist system was very, very balanced, that everything in nature had its counterpart. Don't want to get into off on these highways and byways of metaphysics. In Atonism, what you see immediately is a very skewed theology, in which all that matters is light. And interestingly, and for those who studied Judaism, they'll pick up on this, in Atonism, there is only a love of this world. It's materialistic in a very true sense. It's also monotheistic, like Amonism was, but it's very, very heavy-duty, chronically monotheistic. It's materialistic because in the world of light, you're here. It's the world of the senses and the world of experience. So this Akhenaten, even some of the statues that were done of him, you see, portray him. In fact, there's even pictures of him in his garden with his wife and his kids all running around naked and stuff. He was a very sensualistic kind of creature. It didn't matter about Osiris and the gods of the dead. He no longer wanted any of the gods of the darkness pacified. He didn't want to, consider or concern himself with, the other world or the underworld or whatever the Egyptians thought of it. It was all about what you do in this world. This, is an element in Judaism also. The criticism of Judaism is that it's also going to be seen from a positive side, deal with what you have here. So there's both positive and negative aspects of it as well. Too much thinking of another world makes you an escapist. So there's arguments pro and con with this thing, It just means how far you take it. But basically, you see, the fact is that the people in the Bible that are called the Israelites, right, or the Judites, these are individuals who are now proven to be, connected to these Hyksos, connected to these Antonists of ancient Egypt, dating to 1400 BC. But my story always picks up with who their origins were, and also what happened to them after they left. I also concur with Sigmund Freud, you see, and many other scholars who have contended that the biblical figure Moses was Akhenaten, or somebody in the Pharaoh's circle. I absolutely believe he was Akhenaten, straight up. No doubt about it in my mind at all. That Moses, the one the Bible is calling Moses, was none other than Akhenaten himself, and the symbolism fits. And that this guy, was thrown out of Egypt. And the story of them involves, you see, to come full circle, involves Ireland, believe it or not. The fascinating story is one of the places that these, because officially the biblicists might acknowledge that, well, we know that these characters may have went to Jerusalem. Of course, they can never tell you where Jerusalem was, but let's leave that aside. They always tell you they went to Sinai, and then there's very little evidence for that. And they can't tell you what Sinai was, and Sinai is even a word that could stand for the Pyramid of Giza. You see, so that tells you practically nothing, So there's all sorts of quandaries about where they went. Then official Jewish history always tells you, oh well, we know where they went. They were capped. When they were in Jerusalem, they were made captive twice by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians, you see. They were ingratiated into those civilizations, and then finally, after their release from captivity, they made their way slowly across the Caucasus Mountains into the west and Finn. End of story. British Israelites pick up they have a little extra tail. You see, the British Israelites pick up at that point and start telling you their very spurious but very interesting story. And this would constitute an east to west movement, because now you're hearing about the 10 tribes of Israel assimilating into Western countries. That's how they justify the coming of all the symbolisms and the tropes and whatnot. But once you understand that these Israelites are not the people portrayed in the Bible, but these are pharaonic multimillionaires who are taking, in fact, even the movies show you that they're bringing out golden calves and oxen and camels and treasures. Well, why? Wait a minute. That's some slavery. So this is good slavery in my book. So the thing is that these are super wealthy coterie who are easily ingratiated into Babylon, even if you believe that story, but certainly ingratiated into where? Athens. In fact, the word Athens, Aton, and certainly then ingratiated into Rome. Not all the Roman oligarchical families were into them, but many were, including the Pisos, including the Flavians, you see, and a whole host of others that I mentioned in the books. So when ordinary people reading ordinary history in ordinary schools, and they hear about, well, the Romans, British history, the Romans came over, and that's all you know. Yeah, why would they want to do that? What's the untold story of the Roman conquest? Who was paying the bills for that? You know, why would they? Who was the Caesar that sent them out there? You see, there's a whole story there, fascinating story about the Atonists setting themselves up in Rome and then coming over to Britain to so-called in AD 43 to conquer. And then one thing I didn't finish earlier on is this: why I'm not such a big British Israelite fan and I don't wave that flag, and why I don't believe their story about the little Jesus, coming on a day trip to England, and hobnobbing with the Druids and turning all of Christianity, the esoteric tradition of Christianity accepts that he was here on the green and pleasant lands, is because I know in my work that the entire story that is in the Bible, we've been talking about St. Paul being one of the authors, the whole thing was conceived. You know how you have to be conceived and then you're birthed? Granted, it was born in Rome, the story of Jesus in the Bible through St. Paul, the Gospels, the Epistles, whatnot. But where was its conception? My work establishes that the conception of Christianity today, that's the Jesus story, was the British Isles. So what does it matter to me if later in the fiction, and even if it's fact, that they spent their time or they even died in Britain? Well, their story was concocted in Britain. It was conceived there by some very intelligent people. The same people that the Knights Templar families, the Sinclairs, Menzies, are descended from, and the British Royals. All of that crowd, the French Templars, right? The Irish Chaldeans, Scottish Chaldeans, and the British Templars. All of these people are descended from a group, a core group of these Atonists who came to Ireland, the British Isles, about 600 BC. And so the history that you're reading is a concocted history that covers the rise of Christianity, the Romans, yeah, and everything since, right down through the Viking conquests. Then what do you have? The Anglo-Saxons, all this stuff. What we can rethread all of that. Once you know what I'm talking about, it's like history, so many beads, right? This is why I always have a metaphor for it. It's like you've got all these beads that have been thrown to you in school and thrown to you by these books, but where's the golden thread that holds them all together? Once you're able to thread this, then you start to understand one thing led to another, one thing led to another, one thing led to another. And all the time, the people who have been behind this, the ideological descendants who seized the mineral ore in Britain, who wanted to go to Britain for many reasons. One is to grab the mineral ore. Two is to wipe out their greatest enemies, which is the Druids. They had to annihilate them, just like they annihilated the Ammonists, or tried to. So, but you mean Britain is very far on the west. They needed a corporate mercantile headquarters further at the trade routes, which is why Rome was established. And many of the great buildings in Rome are aligned to places in Ireland, by the way, and in Scotland. There's a whole geomantic, what's called geospheric. What's the true word I'm looking for is sacred geometrical, component to all of this, which people can study. But the fact of the matter is that all the things we know today, including all of the machinations politically, but all of the theological matrix, was conceived in Britain by these exiled Atonists. Of course, they weren't called Atonists in Britain. They were actually known as Milesians or Gaels. So anyone who studied the history of Ireland should read my work, because you're going to have threads to the beads. Because who are the Celts? Should we even be using that term? I go into that in my book. Who are the Gaelic people? Was there a group before them? Who are the Druids? Who are the Chaldeans? See, it's all a big mishmash, right? The mythological cycles, the historical cycles of Ireland. Is there any truth to the British Israelite story, as we said? All these fascinating questions. Why did the Romans come there? Why, if Christianity blended so beautifully with Druidism, why were all the Druids slaughtered en masse? You see, we got questions. The Normans, right? They talk about the Celts. That many Irish people erroneously think they're descended from Celts. Then we have the Romans coming, right? And the Romans suppress the Britons. What do the Britons do? We're talking AD now. The Britons go, oh, our friends over there, the Germans, Anglo-Saxons, Teutonics, please come and help us, with the problem with the Romans. They all march over, the famous Anglo-Saxons, help the Britons, and then don't leave. So the Romans go, but the Anglo-Saxons stay and conquer Britain, pushing the Britons over to Wales. So the British tradition becomes Celtic, Welsh Celtic, because they've been pushed there by the famous Anglo-Saxons. So don't mistake that Celtic culture then for the Druidism that I'm talking about. See, again, the thread or the beads. You can have the beads or you can have the thread. And then who are these Anglo-Saxons? Then who are the Normans? You see, we've got questions about all of the phases of British history start to make a great deal of sense when you know who's running the shop. And so that today when you see popes and when you see the British royal family and when you see these tycoons, and it's more importantly, very crucially for today's age, when you see these so-called presidents of the corporation they call the United States of America, dropping phrases, doing things, changing, from the Constitution, these are agents of the British Crown. They're agents of Luciferianism. They're agents of the Masonic structure that goes back to these Atonists. That's why they use that symbolism, and that's why it's all over when you know what you're looking at.
It's a fascinating story, Michael, and definitely looking forward to seeing the talk.
Thank you, Henrik.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.